Hello good people, Big Heavy back with another smaller power bank review. This time with the Bluetti EB3A, that's Echo Bravo 3 Alpha. Goofy name, but otherwise this may be the 300 watt power bank to get. It's got all the features, it's almost as if Bluetti took all the things I complain about in my typical power bank reviews and fixed them in this one relatively small, relatively compact power bank. So we're gonna get into it, we're gonna do a walk around, we're gonna talk usability, we're gonna talk about what's in the box, and then we'll go through who this power bank is for, what kind of use cases you might want a 300 watt hour power bank for, and hit you with some pros and cons. Frankly, there's a lot of pros with this unit, but there are a few cons that we'll address as we get into the review. So first off, let's talk aesthetics. So this is your classic lunchbox, cube style power bank. Not super heavy. I haven't looked at the specs on weight, but I'd say this is probably 10, 12 pounds. And what I love is finally somebody put a handle that collapses on their power bank. I've always liked the handles that they have on Jackery units. Those have the kind of big lunchbox style, but when you're not using the handle, it's taking up a little extra space, makes the thing a little awkward to pack since it's got this handle sticking out of the top. Same thing with the other 300 watt hour power bank I reviewed, that was the Monster Power Grid. But in this guy, the handle is out of the way when he's not in use, and then he comes up. There's a little bit of a detent in there somewhere, so it kind of, once you get it up, tends to stay up. You can see I'm wobbling it around a little. The handle will stay up until you put it down. It's got a reasonably positive action. It's not the most robust handle I've ever laid a hand on, pun intended, but it's very functional. It's got a little bit of a wobble to it, so if you're carrying it and you're kind of moving around, it's not gonna swing around too much. And again, I think it's a killer feature that the thing just pops right in there, gets out of the way when you're not using it. Now, while we're on the top of the unit, there is also a wireless charging pad on there. It's got a 15 watt output. Sometimes you'll see 10 watt output on here. I think that also kind of depends on the phone, the case, and there's half dozen factors. So great that there is this maximum output wireless charging pad, but you may or may not get those 15 watts depending on your phone. I'll spin through the less exciting parts of the power bank before we talk about the front where all the action is. So you can see on the side, there's kind of this little grid pattern. There's a fan in there for cooling. The fans are a little bit loud. What's interesting is they didn't come on when I was charging the unit, which is great. They do come on when you're trying to run the AC inverter. And oddly enough, after I finished charging it for a bit, I pulled the plug out and the fan spun up. So I don't know if it got a little bit hot after doing some charging and decided it needed to cool itself down, or that's typical, but the fans aren't as much of a hurricane-like howl as something like the EcoFlow, but they're definitely noticeable, and you probably wouldn't want this thing sitting in a quiet room with you. Back of the unit, nothing really going on. I think this comes in a variety of colors. This is the gray, I believe. In terms of build quality and kind of overall plastics, I wouldn't say this is the best I've ever seen in terms of a power bank. Some of the plastic's a little cheaper feeling than some of the others. It doesn't have any real texture or protective bumpers or anything around that, but it's certainly functional and quite reasonable. On a scale of 1 to 10, EcoFlow being like 8, 9-ish, they're kind of the top of the plastics game, I would say. I'd give these guys a solid 6, 7. So nothing to write home about, but nothing to throw out the window either. So let's get down to business on the front of this unit. And the first two things you'll notice, number one, pretty good sized display here. And thank goodness somebody finally put all the information you'd ever want on a power bank on the display. So you've got your typical segmented power meter. These are okay-ish. I find that they generally don't tend to accurately represent how much battery life you have left. You'll tend to see the first couple or 3 segments last for 2/3 of the battery, and then it falls down pretty rapidly. But they did add a percentage, thank goodness, and then they went with what I think is the class-leading thing that you want on a display on a power bank, and that's the estimated runtime that you have remaining. That'll change obviously as you start to plug things in and out of the device, so it actually takes the load that you're using and figures out how much runtime you have. You also have an indication of your output watts and your input watts. That lets you get a little more granular in seeing exactly how much power you're using at a given time, as well as how much power is going into the unit. That comes in handy if you've got this device hooked up to some solar panels and you're also maybe trying to charge a phone, or in some cases maybe run a cooler or something like that. You can kind of figure out how much power you're using versus how much power you're adding back in and come up with a little ad hoc energy estimate. But that runtime remaining will also factor in both your inputs and your outputs. So that ultimately does some of the math for you. but it's not always 100% accurate, particularly when you have devices that will turn on and off. So something like a cooler, where the cooler will run, then it will turn off for a while. Then once it finds out it's getting a little warmer, it'll kick in the compressor again. Similar deal with solar panels. You know, you might have a whole bunch of light hitting your solar panel and you can see how much power you're actually getting. And then some clouds roll in, or you know, maybe you've got some trees or something in the way, and you can see how that impacts your power input. As is fairly typical, you also have indicators for which of your outputs are turned on or off. There's a switch to turn on your DC outputs and a switch to turn on your AC outputs, as well as a switch to turn on this light that's over here, which is kind of the other prominent feature on the front of this unit. And if you've watched any of my reviews in the past, I always complain about lights on the side. I think they're stupid. You know, nobody's gonna carry a 9-pound, not very good flashlight that, you know, you have to carry around like this. And I've always said, I don't understand why manufacturers don't put the light on the front where it would actually be useful. Because if you need a light when you're using a power bank, you probably need it to see the inputs and figure out, you know, how to navigate a little tiny USB plug into the right receptacle. Bluetti finally listened. Huzzah! Huzzah! So you've got a flashlight on here. You know, it's not gonna save the world in terms of brightness if you're out on a dark and dreary night, but you can just take your hand and kind of cup this a little and you will reflect more than enough light onto the ports on this device so that you can actually see what you're doing, you know, even in a really dark room. I think that's brilliant. You know, we've got lights on our phones. I have a light on my watch. We're surrounded by little tiny flashlights. So if you actually needed a light on a power bank, it would be to do something crazy like use the power bank. And I think it's just brilliant that finally some manufacturer put a light on the front where you can actually use it. I would like it a little bit more, and this is probably a tiny nitpick, if instead of this traditional flashlight lens, you know, maybe they put a little LED strip, maybe they did something like they use in cars where they kind of have those little curved lights that project the light downwards so you could see the front of the unit perfectly. But, you know, I'll take that as way better than some useless light on the side that sends out SOS messages or something goofy like that. In terms of AC outputs, you've got 2 grounded AC plugs on there. That's pretty nice. The other thing that's really nice is you've got a 600-watt inverter. So that means you can get a pretty beefy appliance connected to this, and supposedly the unit will handle up to 1,000-watt peak. And to test that, we'll give this the usual coffee test. So let's head over to the Nespresso. All right, so here we are with the coffee test, and I'm actually out of espresso pods, so we're gonna maybe be a little bit unfair, but I have high hopes for our friend here from Bluetti, and we're gonna see if we can make a full standard size coffee pod with this guy. So let's get the coffee maker plugged into the Bluetti. We'll pull that out of the wall. All right, we're gonna turn on the AC power. That appears to be on. And let's see what happens when we fire this doggy up. So it looks like we're pulling a few watts out of there. Fan spinning up on Bluetti. He's putting out 600 or so watts. Oh, and we got an overload. So he did better than our other 300-watt power bank that we've tested with this Nespresso machine. That was the Monster Power Grid 300. At least it tried. It got a little bit of heat going there. So I'll give some degree of props to the Bluetti. We were pushing it a little bit above its capacity. You know, it is a 600-watt inverter. That's twice the 300-watt inverter that was in my other 300-watt power bank, which is again that Monster Power Grid. So failed the coffee test, and you know, not too surprising there, since if we're going to do a high heat appliance, you really probably want a 1,000-watt power bank at a minimum, since those usually tend to come with a 1,000-watt inverter. So let's go back to the review. So I've got to say I had high hopes that this would be the first 300-watt power bank I've tested. You know, frankly, the first less than 1,000-watt power bank I've tested that could handle the Nespresso. Unfortunately, we didn't quite make it, but it was able to at least run the machine for a few seconds before it came on and said there was an overload. It's got a nice little blinky red overload indicator, so that's pretty straightforward. On the DC output front, there's some really good news and a little bit of minor bad news. So the really good news is a couple of things. You have your 2 standard USB-A ports. Those are your typical rectangular USB ports that you'd see on your computer that we've been plugging devices in for the last 20 years or so. You've also got a USB-C port, and that's where some of the good news is. It's a 100-watt power delivery port, so you can plug in a pretty heavy-duty laptop, some of the more modern MacBooks that need a lot of juice. Anything that's going to take advantage of that full 100 watts, this unit will deliver that level of power, which is pretty cool. Now, this gives us a good opportunity to talk about power bank math. So generally, power banks are rated in their capacity in watt hours. So this is about a 300 watt hour power bank. I think it's 296 or something that's close enough for government work. So if you're drawing 100 watts through that USB-C port, you're going to get about 3 hours of life out of this battery pack. So it's as simple as taking our 300 watt hour capacity, dividing it by how many watts we're pulling out. So 100, 300 over 100 equals 3. So that tells us we'd get about 3 hours of runtime out of this power bank, assuming we were pulling that full 100 watts out of the USB-C port. The other interesting DC ports, they have what they call a marine port. This looks like a typical 12-volt automotive port, but it does have a little rotating locking connector that I really like. I've never actually seen these plugs, but I think I'd take the typical 12-volt automotive plug that's on my Iceco cooler and maybe replace it with one of these marine plugs that actually locks in, since some of these plugs do have a tendency to fall out, particularly if you're driving somewhere and the cooler is vibrating around, if you're off-road or overlanding. You don't want that cooler plug to vibrate loose, which it can do pretty easily, and then you've got a cooler full of spoiled food. One of the other miraculous features that I often complain about with power banks, but Bluetti seems to have listened, is the power input right here is just a standard power receptacle. So it's the same kind of plug you'd find on the back of your monitor, on the back of computers. Uses a fairly standard AC cord. There's no external power brick, there's nothing to lose. And what I love about that is, number one, if you're in some sort of emergency situation, you're not scrambling around trying to figure out where the heck did I leave the power brick. And number two, if the thing breaks, you don't have some proprietary power adapter that you need. You can scrounge up one of these computer cords. I would get something that's the appropriate gauge wire since it does carry a lot of current, and you're back in operation. Speaking of charging, the unit does have a fast charge feature, which is pretty cool. They claim that it'll charge from 0 to 80% in about 30 minutes and get a full charge in a little over an hour and a half. That I think is excellent. The reason that that might be important to you is if you're doing something like a road trip where you're doing kind of a cannonball run and you're sleeping for 4 or 5 hours. You plug this guy in, he's ready to rock and roll in a little under 2 hours versus some of the other power banks that might take 6 to 8 hours to get full, in which case if you're using the whole bank during the day, you may ultimately run out of power after a few days on the road. You also have these two DC 12-volt barrel connectors. I really like the idea of these. I would use them to charge a 12-volt radio. I have a couple little ham radios and walkie-talkies that have a 12-volt power brick that you plug into the wall, and I would replace that with one of these connectors. It's a grand idea. Unfortunately, I haven't executed on it yet, so I'm not sure how difficult that'd be, but in theory, it should be as simple as figuring out what kind of plug the radio uses, and generally they'll print the specifications for that on the side of the device, and then what kind of connector I need on this side. And I think Bluetti sells some cords that have the male side of the plug and then basically have two naked wires at the end that you could solder to whatever kind of plug you needed and make your own adapters. If you don't want to do that, 600 watts is more than enough to power the wall warts that come with those types of devices. So you could just plug them in here and, yes, you'll have a little bit of loss as you go from converting the DC power that's inside the battery to AC in the inverter, back to DC through that power brick and into your radio, but might save you the time and hassle of having to make your own cables. The other great thing I'll say about this power bank, I sometimes complain about accessories. They were good enough to give you a solar connector in the box. And what I love about this is it has standard MC4 connectors on the end. So you should be able to connect this to just about any solar panel on the market. Even if you've got something like a Jackery panel that has its own proprietary connectors, you can almost always find something that'll go from whatever weird connector you're dealing with to MC4, which are these sort of funny plugs that have black and white wires attached to them. So as long as you can get your panel, and even big old panels on top of your house will generally have MC4 connectors. If you can get it to here, you can plug it in. There are some concerns about how much voltage you're putting in. They give you a nice warning sticker on here that in 4,000 languages basically says only use panels with the right voltage. So you will have to do a little figuring if you're not using one of the Bluetti panels and make sure whatever you've got with the right connector is not going to blow up the charge controller that's inside this unit. One thing they don't give you is a 12-volt connector, so there is an input that you could use for both solar or you could plug into your car through a standard cigarette lighter port. I frankly rarely use those, and they do sell one that's $10, so it's not much of an add-on if you do need that. versus a lot of the companies will sell their proprietary solar adapters for 15, 20, 40 bucks because they know you're a little bit of a captive audience, versus Bluetti, who gave us the solar connector, thank goodness, and if we want the automobile connector, can get one for a pretty reasonable price. So pros and cons of this unit. I think there's a lot going for it. It's got all the outputs you would want. I maybe would like to see another standard USB on there, or maybe throw me another USB-C since the world's kind of moving in that direction. But 3 is not bad. If you did need more, you could always plug a 12-volt automobile style adapter in there that has a couple of USBs on it. You could plug your favorite wall wart into there that has, 1 to a multitude of USB ports on there. So that's not too huge to rectify if you've got a family of 10 or something and all need to charge your phone simultaneously. I would like to see somebody take, instead of a flashlight, standard flashlight style lighting system, put some neat little light bars or some sort of automotive style thing. Well, that's a pretty aggressive nitpick. Again, I think if you're going to be using one of these things in the dark, if you're out camping or whatnot, you probably have a headlamp or flashlight with you. If all the power has gone out and you have no phones, no watches, no other flashlights around you, and your best bet is the light that's on your power bank. At least in this case, they made it easy to find. You can kind of feel it and feel where the switch is. They made it so you kind of take your hand and deflect the light a little bit. You can see everything that's on the panel. You can get your stuff plugged in and be all set. The fans on here are a little bit noisy. Again, they're not up to EcoFlow levels, but if you're going to be generating power and you're going to have an inverter that pumps out a pretty fair amount of energy, you're going to need some fans. If you're going to have that quick charging feature, you're also going to need some fans. And these are pretty typical fans. I would imagine they cut costs here and didn't use the quietest fans that are available. There are quieter fans. To me, it's not a huge deal. If you're going to be running a high current device that's plugged into here, you got to kind of expect some fans when you're dealing with an inverter. And if you're doing the rapid charging, again, you kind of got to expect some fans, and at least you only have to put up with it for about 90 minutes. I'd like to see just a tiny bit better build quality. This handle is okay, it's not great. Totally functional, feels good. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't last and why it wouldn't do what it needs to do. But maybe a little bit better build quality. Although I will say that Bluetti priced this pretty aggressively. These things go on sale pretty regularly. There's a link down in the notes where you can go and see the current prices. There's almost invariably some sort of coupon you can apply on Amazon or some sort of other discount available. And not only do I think this has some of the best features, best display, lack of a power brick, great size, kind of everything going for it, it's priced pretty attractively as well. So who is this for? I think in general, a 300 wattish power bank is for a couple different scenarios. So one is if you're going camping and you're not bringing 12-volt coolers, you're not bringing anything motorized or anything that's going to generate a lot of heat. You're basically going out for a weekend and you want to be able to charge up your phones, maybe charge up a Bluetooth speaker or two. Please don't turn the thing to 11 when other people are trying to enjoy the wilderness, because that's just kind of shitty.
The numbers all go to 11.
But maybe you're going to charge some lanterns, some headlamps, that sort of thing. 300 watt hours is going to be more than good enough for that. That's probably enough to charge your phone 15 to 20 times, depending on which phone you have. Enough to charge a little headlamp, probably 20, 30 times. So it's great for that application. The other spot this size power bank is appropriate for is if you're going on a road trip. Maybe you've got a whole bunch of people in your vehicle. You have an older vehicle that doesn't have a lot of USB plugs in there. You throw one of these guys in the back seat. People can plug in their gaming devices. They can charge their phones, charge up their iPads, keep themselves amused during a long road trip. And then with that fast charge feature, you plug this guy in while you go out to dinner so you don't have to listen to the fans. And when you come back, it's all charged up and ready for your next day on the road. I think this 300 watt hour size is also not bad for the kind of one night power outage type scenario. You could probably run a typical household refrigerator for 7 to 10 hours, depending on how warm it is outside. That's assuming your fridge is fairly efficient, so it's not going to be running the compressor constantly. But a fridge is not a super high draw appliance. 600 watts should be more than enough to keep that guy powered. And you can also plug your phones in, kind of charge up overnight, get any weather information, or if you were, had a hurricane or something nearby that took out power for a day or two, this would more than meet your needs. 300 watts is going to be stretching it for more than a couple days if you're doing anything more than just charging phones. So do keep that in mind. I think sometimes the power bank companies kind of present these as this magical solution that's going to run your whole house. And yes, there are power banks that will indeed run your whole house, but they're in the multiple thousands of dollar range. They're certainly not little 300 watt guys that you can pick up with one hand. So bringing this all home, if those use cases sound appropriate to you, if you're looking for something for camping and you're not going to be running coolers or anything like that, you want something that's a little bit more than one of those tiny handheld power bricks in case there's an emergency and you need to be able to charge your phones for a couple or 3 days. You want something for road trips. 300 watts is a nice size, and I really don't think you can beat just the design, the number of outputs, the fast charging, the features, the not having an extra power brick to tote around, and the pricing of this Bluetti EB3A. So with that, hope you're charged up for your next adventure. You may find it shocking, but I'll try and bring you some more power bank reviews in the future. And until then, this is the Big Heavy wishing you well and saying peace. Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You are right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.